Lorraine Adams stood behind the counter of the Misty Vale Book Haven, her reading glasses perched on her nose as she carefully cataloged a new shipment of mystery novels. At 67, she had the kind of face that invited confidences. Gentle crow's feet around warm hazel eyes, silver hair pulled back in a practical bun, and a smile that seemed to understand everything without judging anything. The morning light filtered through the bookstore's large front windows, casting golden patterns across the worn wooden floors. Lorraine had always loved this time of day, before the town fully awakened, when she could arrange her books in peace and prepare for the steady trickle of customers who would wander in throughout the day. "Morning, Lorraine!" called out Margaret Chen, the baker from across the street, as she bustled through the door with a basket covered in checkered cloth. "Brought you some fresh scones, blueberry, just how you like them." "You spoil me, Margaret," Lorraine said, her voice carrying the subtle remnants of what might have been a more formal accent, smoothed over by 15 years in this small mountain town. "Join me for tea?" Margaret settled into one of the worn armchairs that made the bookstore feel more like someone's living room than a business. This was exactly how Lorraine had designed it when she took over the failing shop 15 years ago. The previous owner had been ready to close, but Lorraine had seen potential, not for profit, but for purpose. She had transformed the space into a community gathering place. In addition to the carefully curated book selection, there were comfortable reading nooks, a corner dedicated to local authors, shelves of free books for children, and a bulletin board where neighbors posted announcements about everything from lost cats to community yard sales. "How's your mother doing?" Lorraine asked, pouring Earl Grey from her thermos into two mismatched cups she kept behind the counter. "Better now that you recommended that large print edition of the Agatha Christie collection. She's been going on about Hercule Poirot for days." Margaret smiled, then lowered her voice. "Though I am worried about her finances." She mentioned something about a wonderful investment opportunity that some nice people from a senior wellness organization told her about. Lorraine's hand paused almost imperceptibly as she handed over the cup. "What kind of organization?" "Golden Years Advisory, I think. They've been hosting free dinners at the community center. Mom went last week and came back with all these brochures about reverse mortgages and annuity transfers. She seemed really excited about it, but the whole thing made me nervous." "I see," Lorraine said carefully, filing the information away in a part of her mind that had lain dormant for many years. "Perhaps I should attend one of these dinners. I am, after all, of the target demographic." Margaret laughed. "You're sharper than people half your age, Lorraine. I can't imagine anyone pulling a fast one on you." If only you knew, Lorraine thought, but smiled warmly instead. "Still, it never hurts to stay informed about financial planning at our age. When is the next dinner?" "Thursday evening, I think. Mom has the flyer on her refrigerator if you want the details." After Margaret left, Lorraine stood at the window, watching the gentle morning activity of Misty Vale's main street. She loved this town with its population of barely 3,000 souls, where everyone knew everyone else's business, or thought they did. She loved the way mist rolled down from the surrounding mountains each morning, giving the valley its name. She loved the unhurried pace, the genuine kindness of the neighbors, the simple rhythms of life. The town had a timeless quality to it. The main street still featured buildings from the early 1900s, their brick facades lovingly maintained. The general store still operated with the same family who had opened it in 1947. The town square still hosted a farmer's market every Saturday morning, where local growers sold produce and homemade preserves. She had come here seeking peace after the storm, seeking redemption after the unforgivable. The bell above the door chimed, pulling her from her thoughts. Thomas Wu, the town's elderly pharmacist, entered with his characteristic shuffle, his cane tapping against the wooden floor. Morning, Thomas. The new John Grisham came in yesterday. I set aside a copy for you. You're a treasure, Lorraine. His weathered face crinkled with pleasure, but something in his eyes seemed troubled. Actually, I wanted to ask your opinion about something. You always seem to have such good judgment about things. Lorraine gestured to the armchair Margaret had just vacated. Thomas settled down with a grateful sigh, placing his cane carefully against the chair's arm. It's probably nothing, he began, but I've been a bit concerned. 3 of my regular customers, all elderly, all living alone, have recently transferred their prescriptions to the pharmacy in Rivertown. That's a 40-minute drive. When I asked why, they seemed embarrassed, said they were moving to assisted living facilities there. That's unusual? Very. These were people deeply rooted here. Mrs. Patterson has lived in the same house for 50 years. Her garden is her pride and joy. She's won the Town Beautification Award 3 times. And here's the odd part. When I ran into her at the post office last week, she was still here, not in any assisted living. She looked uncomfortable when I asked about it and changed the subject quickly. Lorraine's pulse quickened slightly, though her expression remained calm and interested. Did these transfers happen around the same time? All within the past 2 months. And there's more. I heard from Nancy at the credit union that there's been unusual activity in several senior accounts. Large withdrawals, money being moved around. She can't give details, of course, but she mentioned it to me in confidence because she's worried. She said some of the transactions didn't seem to match the typical patterns for these customers. Has anyone reported anything to Sheriff Morrison? Thomas shrugged. You know how it is. Everyone's embarrassed to admit they might have made a financial mistake. Pride is a powerful thing, especially for people who've been independent their whole lives. And the sheriff's department is just Morrison and Deputy Peters. They're good people, but stretched thin. They're more equipped to handle traffic violations and the occasional bar fight than financial crimes. After Thomas left with his novel, Lorraine turned the open sign to back in 15 minutes and walked to the small office behind the counter. She sat at her desk, fingers steepled beneath her chin, a gesture from her old life when she had sat on a different kind of bench. 25 years she had served as a judge in the city's circuit court. 25 years of weighing evidence, interpreting law, seeking justice. She had been good at it, respected by colleagues and attorneys alike, fair but firm, compassionate but clear-eyed. She had handled everything from minor civil disputes to serious criminal cases, always striving to apply the law with both precision and humanity. She had loved the intellectual challenge of complex cases, the satisfaction of untangling complicated legal questions, the responsibility of ensuring that justice was served. She had taken seriously the weight of the decisions she made, knowing that her rulings affected real people's lives in profound ways. Until the Bradford case. Richard Bradford, a state senator with his eyes on the governor's mansion. Charges of embezzlement, fraud, corruption. The evidence had been overwhelming. Documents, recordings, testimony from credible witnesses. The prosecution had built a meticulous case, spending 2 years gathering proof of Bradford's systematic looting of state funds, his manipulation of contracts to benefit his associates, his web of kickbacks and bribes. Lorraine had presided over the trial, had heard every word, had seen the smirk on Bradford's face that said he knew he was untouchable. She had maintained perfect judicial composure throughout the proceedings, but privately she had been disgusted by the arrogance of a man who believed his position placed him above the law. Then the pressure had begun. Phone calls to her home at midnight, breathing on the line, then silence. Anonymous letters detailing her daily routines, the schools her grandchildren attended, the route her daughter took to work. Her car vandalized in the courthouse parking garage, Photos of her family slipped under her door, grainy surveillance-style images that made it clear she was being watched. The message was clear: make the case go away, or others would suffer. She had gone to her superiors, to law enforcement. They had promised protection, promised investigation. But Bradford's web of influence ran deep. Police who started looking into the threats were suddenly transferred to other cases. Her requests for protection were met with bureaucratic delays. And then key evidence began to disappear. When a crucial piece of evidence mysteriously vanished from the court's secure storage, a hard drive containing financial records that were central to the prosecution's case. And when two witnesses suddenly recanted their testimony, claiming they had been mistaken in their identification, Lorraine had seen the writing on the wall. She could have pushed forward, should have. But the final threat had been explicit. A letter containing photos of her 8-year-old grandson getting on the school bus with a simple message: "Children are so vulnerable. It would be a shame if something happened." So she had done the unthinkable. She had found a technicality, a procedural error in how evidence had been initially collected, an error that she herself stretched into significance, knowing that it was questionable at best. She had dismissed the case on those grounds. Bradford had walked free, his smirk widening into a triumphant grin as he left the courtroom. Within months, he had won his gubernatorial race, riding a wave of publicity about how he had been vindicated against politically motivated charges. Lorraine had resigned the next day. She had told no one the real reason, had simply cited health concerns and a desire to retire and spend time with family. Her colleagues had thrown her a retirement party, praising her years of service, presenting her with a plaque commemorating her dedication to justice. She had smiled and accepted their kind words, all while feeling like a fraud. Then she had packed a single suitcase, left everything behind, her house, her friends, her entire life, and driven until she found a place where no one knew Judge Lorraine Adams. That was 15 years ago. 15 years of selling books, hosting reading groups, drinking tea with neighbors, and trying to forget the weight of the gavel she had once wielded. 15 years of trying to silence the voice in her head that told her she had betrayed everything she believed in. But old skills don't disappear. Old instincts don't fade. And as Lorraine sat in her small office, the pieces were already beginning to arrange themselves in her mind like evidence on a court docket. She pulled out a notebook and began writing. At the top of the page, she wrote, "Golden Years Advisory." Below that, she created columns. Who, what, when, how, why. It was the same systematic approach she had used for 25 years to organize complex cases. If something was happening in Misty Vale, if vulnerable seniors were being targeted, she needed to understand the full scope before she could determine how to respond. And this time, she told herself, this time she wouldn't back down. She had failed once out of fear. She wouldn't fail again. The Golden Years Advisory Dinner was held on a Thursday evening at the Misty Vale Community Center, a modest building that served as the town's hub for everything from voting to wedding receptions. Lorraine arrived early, wearing a cardigan that made her look even more grandmotherly than usual, her posture slightly stooped as if she were frailer than she truly was. The parking lot was filling with vehicles driven by Misty Vale's senior citizens. She recognized most of them. Mrs. Patterson, who Thomas had mentioned, Harold Green, the retired postmaster, Evelyn Frost, who had been the elementary school principal for 30 years, and at least a dozen others, all over 65, all living on fixed incomes of pensions and Social Security. Lorraine took a moment to observe before going inside. The cars in the parking lot told their own story, older models, well-maintained but showing their age, the kinds of vehicles driven by people who couldn't afford to replace them frequently. These were not wealthy people. They were comfortable, perhaps, but not affluent. Exactly the demographic that would be vulnerable to financial manipulation disguised as helpful advice. Inside, the community center had been transformed. Round tables draped with white cloths, each set with elegant place settings that seemed incongruous with the usual potluck dinners held in this space. A presentation screen at the front, soft classical music playing from quality speakers, fresh flower arrangements on each table. Someone had invested significant money in creating an atmosphere of sophistication and trustworthiness. Two people in expensive suits greeted attendees at the door, a man and a woman, both in their 40s, with practiced smiles and firm handshakes. Their clothing was professional, but not ostentatious, carefully calculated to inspire confidence without seeming too corporate. Welcome! I'm Derek Thornton, and this is my associate, Vanessa Price. We're so glad you could join us tonight for this educational dinner about protecting your financial future. Lorraine shook their hands, noting the quality of Derek's watch, a Rolex that probably cost more than most people in this room spent on housing in a year, and the designer label on Vanessa's handbag. These were not small-town operators. These were professionals running a sophisticated operation. Lorraine Adams, she said, adding a slight tremor to her voice that wasn't entirely feigned. I run the little bookstore downtown. I'm afraid I don't know much about financial matters. My late husband always handled such things. It was a lie. She had never been married, but it fit the profile she was creating. The helpless widow, overwhelmed by managing her own finances, looking for guidance from people who seemed to know what they were doing. That's exactly why we're here, Vanessa said warmly, guiding Lorraine to a table. So many seniors, especially women, find themselves overwhelmed by financial decisions after losing a spouse. We help simplify everything so you can enjoy your retirement without worry. Lorraine was seated at a table with 3 other women, all of whom she knew from town. Betty Armstrong, who had worked at the library before Martha. Susan Caldwell, whose husband had died 2 years ago. And Patricia Moody, who lived on a modest pension from her years as a school teacher. Lorraine, Betty exclaimed. I didn't know you were interested in financial planning. Oh, I'm not really, Lorraine said, maintaining her helpless widow persona. But Margaret mentioned these dinners, and I thought it couldn't hurt to learn something. Are you looking into their services? Betty lowered her voice. I already signed up for a consultation. They were so helpful when I came to the last dinner. They explained about how I could get more income from my house without having to sell it. It sounds perfect. I can stay in my home and have more money each month. Lorraine's internal alarm bells rang louder, but she kept her expression pleasantly curious. That does sound wonderful. How does it work? It's called a reverse mortgage, Susan chimed in. I signed up for one last month. Instead of paying the bank, they pay me. And I don't have to pay it back until I sell the house or pass away. What Susan didn't mention, what Lorraine suspected Susan didn't fully understand, were the accumulating interest charges, the fees, the ways that such arrangements could quickly erode home equity and leave nothing for heirs or, worse, create situations where seniors lost their homes entirely. The dinner was salmon with roasted vegetables, expensive for a free event. The wine flowed freely, lowering inhibitions and creating a convivial atmosphere. Lorraine sipped water, watching everything, noting the way Derek and Vanessa circulated among the tables, paying particular attention to certain individuals. She noticed they had a system. Vanessa would engage people in casual conversation, asking seemingly innocent questions. How long have you lived in Misty Vale? Is your house one of those beautiful Victorians on Elm Street? Do you have family in the area? Each question gathering intelligence about assets, support systems, vulnerability. Derek stood to give the presentation after dessert. a rich chocolate mousse that had clearly not come from any local caterer. His speech was polished, hitting every psychological trigger with precision. He spoke of outliving savings, of medical expenses that insurance didn't cover, of the burdens seniors didn't want to place on their children. He painted pictures of uncertainty and fear, then offered solutions that sounded miraculous. The average American senior has significant wealth tied up in their home, he explained, charts and graphs appearing on the screen behind him. But that wealth isn't working for you. It's just sitting there while you struggle to make ends meet on a fixed income. What if you could access that wealth without selling your home, without making monthly payments? What if your house could finally give back to you after all those years of mortgage payments? The pitch was masterful. He acknowledged concerns before people could voice them, offered testimonials from satisfied customers, cited statistics from authoritative-sounding sources. He made it all sound so reasonable, so sensible, so obviously in the senior's best interests. Reverse mortgages that let you access your home's equity while continuing to live there. Annuity transfers that guarantee income for life, protecting you from market volatility. Trust restructuring that ensures your assets are protected and your wishes are honored. And our comprehensive estate planning services ensure your loved ones are taken care of exactly as you want. What he didn't explain were the fees, the origination fees, the servicing fees, the mortgage insurance premiums that could add up to tens of thousands of dollars. He didn't mention the interest rates, often significantly higher than traditional mortgages, compounding monthly. He didn't clarify that guaranteed income for life from annuities often meant locked-in funds with massive surrender charges for early withdrawal. He didn't detail how trust restructuring could mean signing over control of assets to people you'd just met. But the language was technical enough, the presentation smooth enough, delivered with enough authority and confidence that most people in the room would hear only the reassuring promises. Lorraine watched the faces around her. She saw hope, relief, excitement. She saw people who had been worried about money, about aging, about being a burden, suddenly seeing what looked like a solution to all their problems. After the presentation, Vanessa and Derek circulated, setting up individual consultations. Lorraine watched their technique, noting how they targeted specific individuals. They clearly worked from some kind of pre-screening. They spent longest with those who owned homes outright, who had mentioned savings accounts, who had talked about pensions or inheritance. They were hunters, and they had identified their prey. Mrs. Adams? Derek appeared at her elbow, his smile warm and sincere. I couldn't help but notice you live on Pine Street. 15 years, Lorraine said. Bought it outright when I moved here after my husband passed. It's far too big for just me now, but I can't bear to leave. So many memories, you know. She saw the flash of interest in his eyes before he masked it. A house on Pine Street owned outright by an elderly widow living alone. She had just painted a target on herself. Those homes are quite valuable, Derek said, his tone casual but his attention focused. The real estate market in these mountain towns has really appreciated. You're sitting on a significant asset. Have you thought about ways to access that equity while still living in your home? I wouldn't want to lose my house, Lorraine said, infusing worry into her voice. It's all I have left of my life with Edward. Of course not. That's the beauty of our approach. You maintain full ownership, full residence rights. We simply help you access the wealth you've already built up. Let me get you some information. He signaled to Vanessa, who brought over a glossy folder embossed with the Golden Years Advisory logo. Over the next 20 minutes, Derek laid out a proposal that, to an unsophisticated eye, might have sounded reasonable. But Lorraine's trained legal mind caught every red flag. The reverse mortgage terms that started at what seemed like a reasonable rate, but included language allowing for significant increases. The annuity with surrender charges that would trap her funds for 15 to 20 years, far longer than most people her age could reasonably expect to live. The trust restructuring that would essentially transfer control of her assets to their professional management team. And the best part, Derek said, lowering his voice confidentially, is that all of these strategies have significant tax advantages. You'd be surprised how much money seniors lose to unnecessary taxation simply because they don't have proper planning. It was a common tactic, invoking the specter of taxation, the government taking what was rightfully yours, unless you took these special steps to protect your assets. Never mind that most of what he was describing had minimal actual tax benefit and might even create tax complications. I'd need to think about this, Lorraine said, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for the folder. Perhaps discuss it with my children? A flicker of something, annoyance, concern, crossed Derek's face before his smile returned. Of course, of course. Family input is important, though I should mention that our current promotional rates are only available through the end of this month. After that, the terms won't be nearly as favorable. But naturally, you should take time to consider. The pressure was subtle but real. Create urgency. Make her feel like she might miss out on something valuable, but give the illusion of being reasonable, of supporting her autonomy. Why don't we schedule a home visit? Derek continued. I can bring our estate planning specialist to review everything in detail, answer any questions you have. Sometimes it's easier to understand when someone can walk you through it step by step. That would be wonderful, Lorraine said. How about next Tuesday afternoon? I have book club in the morning, but I'm free after 2. Perfect. We'll see you then, Mrs. Adams. As she left, she pocketed several of the brochures and business cards, along with the glossy folder. The other attendees were lingering, some already signing up for consultations, others chatting excitedly about the possibilities Derek had presented. Once in her car, she sat for a moment, organizing her thoughts. Then she drove not home, but to the town's small public library. Martha Reynolds, the librarian, was just about to close. Lorraine, what brings you by so late? Research project, Lorraine said. Do you still have access to those legal databases through the state library system? Of course. Are you finally writing that novel you've been threatening to write? Lorraine smiled. Something like that. Would you mind if I use the computer for an hour or so? I know it's past closing time. For you, stay as long as you need. I'll be in the back cataloging. Just turn off the lights and lock the door when you leave. You still have that spare key I gave you, right? I do. Thank you, Martha. Lorraine settled at the computer and began to search. Derek Thornton, Vanessa Price, Golden Years Advisory. What she found was damning, though carefully disguised. The company was registered in Delaware, a common choice for businesses seeking privacy and favorable legal treatment. The ownership structure involved multiple shell companies, making it difficult to determine who actually controlled the organization. They operated in small towns across 3 states, always staying just below the radar of major regulatory attention. There were complaints filed with Better Business Bureaus in multiple jurisdictions, but always settled quietly with non-disclosure agreements. A pattern emerged of elderly clients losing significant assets, but no criminal charges had ever been filed. The company operated in that gray area between legal and ethical, using contracts that were technically valid but practically predatory. They were good. They stayed on the legal side of the line, barely, using contracts that were properly executed, terms that were disclosed in the fine print, even if that fine print was deliberately obscure. They knew exactly which laws protected them and which elderly victims were unlikely to fight back. Lorraine dug deeper, using search techniques she had learned in her judicial days, cross-referencing names, following corporate trails, checking court dockets, and then she found it. A sealed court case from 7 years ago in a different state. The records were restricted, but the docket numbers and dates were visible. A class action lawsuit that had been filed against a company called Senior Security Solutions. Different name. But when she traced the corporate registrations, the ownership connected back to the same shell companies that now owned Golden Years Advisory. The case had been settled out of court for an undisclosed sum, with all records sealed as part of the settlement agreement. But the mere existence of a class action suggested a pattern of behavior significant enough that multiple victims had banded together. She noted everything down, building a file the way she had built hundreds of files over her years on the bench. "Find what you needed?" Martha asked when Lorraine finally emerged from the computer area, her notebook full of notes. "More than I expected," Lorraine said truthfully. "Martha, do you know if anyone in town has legal training? A paralegal, perhaps, or someone who worked in law offices?" Martha thought for a moment. "Well, Robert Chen, Margaret's husband, used to be a legal secretary before they moved here to open the bakery. He worked for a firm in the city for almost 20 years. Why do you ask?" "Just curious. I might need some help with a project. Thank you, Martha. And thank you for letting me stay late." Over the weekend, Lorraine conducted her own quiet investigation. She visited Mrs. Patterson on the pretense of bringing her a book she thought she might enjoy. A cozy mystery set in an English village. "How lovely!" Mrs. Patterson exclaimed, inviting her in for tea. The house was immaculate but showed signs of financial stress. The thermostat set lower than comfortable on a chilly autumn day. Generic brands in the kitchen where name brands used to be. A notice from the electric company on the counter, warning of service disconnection if payment wasn't received within 10 days. Lorraine had known Dorothy Patterson for 15 years. She was a proud woman, one who had worked as a nurse for 40 years before retiring. Her late husband had been a mechanic. They had lived modestly but comfortably. This evidence of financial struggle was new. "How are you managing, Dorothy?" Lorraine asked gently, accepting the tea in a cup that showed the faint gold rim was wearing thin from years of use. The older woman's face crumpled slightly. "Oh, Lorraine, I've made such a mess of things. Those nice people from Golden Years Advisory, they said they could help me get more income from my house. Mr. Thornton explained it all so clearly, and it seemed like such a good solution. I signed some papers, and now, well, I'm getting money each month. But there are all these fees, and they said I needed to transfer some of my savings into their managed accounts for optimal tax efficiency. And I'm so confused." She pulled out a stack of papers, her hands shaking slightly. "I thought this would solve my problems, but now I have less money than before, somehow. And they keep sending me statements with all these numbers. And I can't make sense of any of it." "Do you have copies of what you signed?" "Yes, but I can't make sense of it all. The print is so small and the language is so complicated. I'm afraid I've been very foolish. May I look at them?" "I'm quite good with details and fine print." What Lorraine saw in those documents made her blood run cold with anger. Dorothy had signed over far more than she understood. The reverse mortgage was at a variable rate that started at 6%, but could spike to 14%, based on market conditions. Conditions that the lender could define broadly. The managed accounts had fees layered upon fees. A 3% annual management fee, transaction costs, administrative charges, and something called a portfolio optimization fee that amounted to another 1% annually. Worst of all, buried in the fine print of the trust restructuring documents was a power of attorney clause that essentially gave Golden Years Advisory, or their designated representatives, control over Dorothy's financial decisions. They could move money, make investments, even sell assets, all under the guise of professional management. Dorothy had effectively signed away control of her financial life to people she had met at a free dinner. Dorothy, have others in town signed similar agreements? I think so. Harold Green mentioned he was working with them too. He seemed very pleased with the arrangement, said it had given him peace of mind. And I know Evelyn Frost went to the dinner last month. She called me asking if I thought they were legitimate, and I told her they seemed very professional. Dorothy's voice caught. Oh dear, I hope I didn't encourage her to make the same mistake I made. Lorraine reached over and took Dorothy's hand. You haven't made a mistake, and you're not foolish. These people are professionals at making complicated things sound simple and beneficial. That's not your fault. But what can I do? I've already signed everything. It's legally binding, isn't it? Let me look into it, Lorraine said. There may be options. In the meantime, don't sign anything else, and don't agree to any changes without talking to me first. Can you do that? Can you? Dorothy nodded, tears of relief in her eyes. Thank you, Lorraine. I didn't know who to turn to. I was too embarrassed to tell anyone. Lorraine spent Sunday visiting 5 more people, always with the pretense of bringing books or checking in as a friendly neighbor. Each had signed agreements with Golden Years Advisory. Each was losing money they couldn't afford to lose. Each was too embarrassed to tell anyone what was happening. Harold Green, the retired postmaster, had signed over his pension to be managed by their financial services division. He was now receiving monthly payments that were significantly less than his original pension, with the difference going to management fees and administrative costs. Evelyn Frost had refinanced her paid-off home with a reverse mortgage that charged her fees of nearly $15,000 up front, money that was simply added to her loan balance, immediately putting her in debt against a house she had owned free and clear. By Monday morning, Lorraine had a clear picture of the scope. At least 15 seniors in Misty Vale had been targeted, representing total assets of over $2 million. The scheme was methodical. Free dinners to identify targets with assets, high-pressure sales tactics disguised as friendly advice, deliberately complex contracts designed to confuse, and quick execution before victims could seek independent counsel. She sat in her bookstore office, looking at the timeline she had constructed on a large sheet of paper, the documents she had photocopied, the notes she had taken. It was all there. The pattern, the practice, the predation. She had evidence of a systematic scheme to defraud elderly residents of their assets, but she was just a bookstore owner. No legal standing, no authority, no power to prosecute or compel restitution, except the power she had always had, the ability to see through to the truth, the knowledge of how the legal system worked, and the determination to do something about it. And this time, she had something else she hadn't had 15 years ago. She had nothing left to lose and nothing left to fear. Lorraine stood in front of her bathroom mirror Tuesday morning, studying her reflection. For 15 years, she had seen only the bookstore owner looking back, soft, approachable, unthreatening, forgettable. But this morning, she saw traces of the woman she used to be. The steel in her eyes, the set of her jaw, the bearing of someone who had once wielded authority and was prepared to do so again, even without official sanction. She thought of Richard Bradford, walking free because she had been afraid. She thought of the grandchildren who had been threatened, who were now grown and safe, living their lives far away from the shadow of that case. She thought of Dorothy Patterson, Harold Green, Evelyn Frost, and all the others who had no one to stand up for them, who were too ashamed or too confused to protect themselves. Not this time, never again. She dressed carefully, not in her usual casual bookstore attire, but in clothes that projected quiet authority. A simple but well-cut blazer, a crisp white blouse. She even pulled her silver hair into a more formal style than her usual casual bun. When she looked in the mirror again, she saw Judge Adams looking back. At 2 o'clock, Derek Thornton and a third colleague, introduced as estate planning specialist, Marcus Webb, arrived at her door with briefcases and warm smiles that didn't quite reach their eyes. "Mrs. Adams, thank you so much for having us," Derek said as Lorraine ushered them into her living room. "What a charming home. Original hardwood floors, built in the 1920s, if I'm not mistaken." 1923, Lorraine confirmed. "Can I offer you tea? I've just made a fresh pot." As she prepared tea in the kitchen, she could hear them moving through her front rooms, their voices low as they appraised the space. She caught fragments of their conversation. Original moldings, at least 3 bedrooms, prime location. They were calculating the value of her home, her assets, their potential commission. When she returned with the tray, they were seated on her sofa, briefcases open, documents arranged on her coffee table in a carefully orchestrated display. For the next hour, they presented their proposal. Lorraine played her part perfectly, the confused widow, overwhelmed by financial jargon, trusting these nice young people who seemed so knowledgeable. She asked simple questions that any unsophisticated person might ask. She expressed worry about being a burden to her children, confessed anxiety about medical expenses, mentioned concern about whether she could afford to maintain her home. All the while, she was watching, analyzing, noting every tactic they employed. They used the contrast principle, first presenting expensive options, then showing discounted rates that seemed reasonable by comparison, but were still exploitative. They employed social proof, mentioning other satisfied Misty Vale residents who had signed up. They created artificial scarcity, emphasizing again that the promotional rates would expire soon. They used technical jargon to confuse, then simplified explanations that omitted crucial details. "And if I sign these papers today, you're certain I can stay in my home?" she asked, her hand trembling slightly as she reached for the pen they had placed so conveniently in front of her. "Absolutely guaranteed," Marcus said smoothly. "You maintain full residence rights for life. This is your home, Mrs. Adams. We're just helping you access the wealth you've already built up over the years." What he didn't say was that upon her death, or if she failed to pay the mounting interest and fees, or if she needed to move to assisted living, the house would belong to their network of investors. What he didn't mention was that the managed accounts they required her to open would be drained by administrative costs that would far exceed any growth. What he glossed over was the clause that gave them financial power of attorney, allowing them to make decisions about her money without her approval. "I just need to use the restroom before we sign," Lorraine said, standing with a slight wobble that suggested frailty. "My hands shake when I'm nervous. Must be my age. Just give me a moment to compose myself." In the bathroom, she took 3 deep breaths, centered herself the way she used to before important trials, then called a number on her cell phone. "Robert? It's Lorraine. They're here now. Are you ready?" "In position," Robert Chen's voice came back. "I've got the camera set up. Good luck, Lorraine." When Lorraine returned to the living room, her demeanor had shifted subtly. The trembling was gone. Her back was straighter, her eyes clearer and more focused. The transformation was slight enough that someone not paying close attention might miss it, but significant enough that Derek's smile faltered just a bit. "Before I sign anything," she said calmly, her voice losing the quaver she had affected earlier, "I'd like to record our conversation. For my records. You don't mind, do you?" Derek's smile faltered. Well, that's not really. I insist, Lorraine said, pulling out her phone and placing it on the table, already recording. After all, if everything is as beneficial as you say, you should have no objection to having it documented. Transparency builds trust, doesn't it? Mrs. Adams, Vanessa began, her tone cooling noticeably, we respect your caution, but our company policy prohibits recording of consultations due to proprietary methodologies and— Then I'm afraid we have nothing more to discuss, Lorraine said. She stood, gathering their papers into a neat stack and holding them out. Thank you for your time, but I'm not interested in doing business with people who won't stand behind their representations. Derek's expression hardened, the friendly mask slipping. Mrs. Adams, I don't think you understand the opportunity you're passing up. These terms won't be available. I understand perfectly, Lorraine interrupted, her voice taking on a tone that 25 years of courtroom experience had honed to precision. I understand that your reverse mortgage carries a variable interest rate that could increase by up to 8 percentage points. I understand that your managed accounts charge a 3% annual fee, plus transaction costs, plus administrative charges, plus portfolio optimization fees. I understand that Clause 7B in your trust restructuring documents gives you power of attorney over my finances. And I understand that you've used these same contracts to extract significant assets from at least 15 other residents of this town. The room went silent. The masks of friendly financial advisors slipped completely, revealing something harder and more predatory underneath. You seem remarkably well informed for a simple bookstore owner, Marcus said slowly, his eyes narrowing as he reassessed her. I read a lot, Lorraine replied. You'd be surprised what you can learn from books and legal databases and public records and careful analysis of contractual language. Shall I tell you what else I've learned? She moved to her desk, pulling out a folder she had prepared. I've learned that Golden Years Advisory has been the subject of 43 formal complaints across 3 states in the past 5 years. I've learned that you specifically target small towns with aging populations and limited local legal resources. I've learned that you previously operated under the name Senior Security Solutions until a class action lawsuit forced you to rebrand. I've learned that you operate in a gray area of financial law, technically legal but fundamentally predatory. Derek stood abruptly, his face flushing with anger. This meeting is over. You can expect to hear from our attorneys about your slanderous accusations. Oh, I hope I do, Lorraine said, her voice calm but implacable. Because I've already compiled a comprehensive report detailing every questionable practice I've uncovered. And I've already prepared documentation to send to the State Attorney General's office, the Consumer Protection Division, the Federal Trade Commission, and the banking regulators. I just haven't sent it yet. Consider this your opportunity to leave Misty Vale quietly before I do. That was a bluff. She hadn't sent anything yet. But their reactions told her everything she needed to know. Vanessa's face went pale. Marcus's jaw clenched. Derek's eyes narrowed with calculation, weighing his options. You have no proof of anything illegal, Derek said carefully, regaining some composure. Not yet, Lorraine agreed, but I will. You see, I've convinced several of your clients to allow me to review their contracts. And what I've found is a pattern of misrepresentation, if not outright fraud. Verbal promises that directly contradict written terms. High-pressure tactics that may constitute elder abuse under state law. Financial instruments sold to people who clearly didn't understand them and who showed signs of cognitive impairment that you chose to ignore or exploit. Those people signed contracts of their own free will, Marcus said. They're adults, legally capable of making their own decisions. Are they? Lorraine asked. Mrs. Patterson is 83 years old with early-stage dementia, which you would have known if you'd done proper due diligence instead of rushing her through a signing. Mr. Green is on medication that affects his cognition. That information is clearly noted in his medical records, which you never requested to see. These aren't just bad business practices, they're potentially criminal. You're making serious allegations, Vanessa said, her voice tight. Do you have any idea who you're dealing with? We have resources you can't imagine. Lawyers who will bury you in motions and discovery requests. We can make your life very difficult. I have a very good idea of who I'm dealing with, Lorraine said calmly. I spent 25 years as a circuit court judge. I presided over hundreds of cases. I know exactly how to build a case, gather admissible evidence, identify legal violations, and pursue appropriate remedies. I also know that what you're counting on is that elderly victims in small towns won't fight back, that they'll be too embarrassed or too confused or too intimidated. But I'm not most people, and I'm not intimidated by threats of litigation. The revelation hung in the air like a grenade. Derek recovered first, his expression shifting to something uglier, more openly hostile. A judge, he said, his voice dripping with contempt. How interesting. Retired, though, aren't you? No authority, no jurisdiction, no power. Just another old woman pretending she still matters, living in the past, trying to feel important again. Lorraine felt a flash of anger, but kept her voice level, refusing to rise to the bait. You're absolutely right that I have no official authority. No badge, no courtroom, no power to issue orders or compel testimony. But I have something more important. I have evidence, I have time, I have knowledge of exactly how the legal system works, and I have absolutely nothing to lose. I'm going to dismantle everything you've built here, piece by piece, entirely within the bounds of the law. We'll bury you in litigation, Derek threatened, stepping closer in what was clearly meant to be an intimidating gesture. We have lawyers on retainer in every state we operate in. They'll tie you up in court for years. You'll spend whatever savings you have on legal fees defending yourself against defamation suits, and you'll die before you see any resolution. Please do try, Lorraine said, not backing down an inch. Discovery in a civil suit will be absolutely fascinating. I'm particularly interested in examining your company's financial records, your client communications, your training materials, and your marketing strategies. All of that becomes fair game in litigation. And while we're in court, I'll make sure every newspaper in the region knows about your practices. I have contacts in journalism. Judges develop relationships with court reporters over 25 years. Small-town news might seem insignificant to you, but regional papers love a good David versus Goliath story. Predatory financial company targets elderly in mountain towns. That's a headline that will get picked up by every news outlet in the state. Marcus stepped forward, his voice low and menacing, all pretense of professionalism abandoned. You're making a very serious mistake, Mrs. Adams, a big one. It would be a real shame if something happened to your lovely bookstore. Old buildings are such fire hazards. All that paper, those wooden shelves, the antique fixtures. One spark, and the whole place could go up. Are you threatening me? Lorraine asked, her voice sharp as a gavel strike. She pulled out her phone again. Because this has been recording our entire conversation, and Robert Chen, who's been positioned in the house across the street, has been photographing and video recording everyone who's entered and left this property. Say hello, Robert. Through the window, they could see Robert step into clear view in the window of the house across the street, camera with a telephoto lens in hand, waving directly at them. You set us up, Vanessa hissed, her composure completely shattered now. I documented a meeting, Lorraine corrected. There's a legal difference, as you'll discover if you choose to pursue this further. Now, here's what's going to happen. You're going to leave Misty Vale and not return. You're going to release every single client you've signed in this town from their contracts without penalty. You're going to return every fee you've collected, including all administrative charges, management fees, and transaction costs. And you're going to do it within 1 week. Derek laughed harshly, but there was uncertainty in his eyes now. Or what? You'll send your little report to some bureaucrats who will take months or years to investigate? By then we'll be long gone, operating under a different name in different towns. And these contracts are ironclad. We had lawyers review every word. You can't break them. Or, Lorraine said quietly, with the absolute conviction of someone who has made a final decision and will not be moved. I'll do what I should have done 15 years ago when I was threatened by someone who thought he was untouchable. I'll fight back with everything I have. I'll contact every single person you've scammed across 3 states. And yes, I have their names from public records and complaint filings. I'll help them organize a class action lawsuit. I'll testify as an expert witness about the predatory nature of your contracts. I'll use every connection I still have in the legal community, and I have many, to make sure this gets the attention it deserves from prosecutors and regulators. She paused, meeting each of their eyes in turn, letting them see the absolute determination there. Richard Bradford thought he was immune to consequences too. He was a state senator, then a governor, with unlimited resources and powerful friends protecting him. But you know what he didn't have? He didn't have right on his side. And eventually, that catches up to you. It took 15 years, but he was finally indicted last month. 17 counts of corruption and fraud. Justice delayed, perhaps, but not denied. You're bluffing, Marcus said, but his voice lacked conviction. He could see she wasn't. I spent a quarter-century calling people's bluffs in a courtroom, Lorraine replied. I'm quite good at distinguishing genuine threats from empty ones. I don't bluff. So, let me ask you, are you willing to bet your entire operation that I won't follow through? Are you willing to risk criminal investigations in multiple jurisdictions? Are you willing to have your names and faces associated with elder abuse in every news outlet in 3 states? Because I am absolutely willing to make that happen. The 3 exchanged glances. A silent conversation played out in those looks. Calculation, assessment, weighing risk versus reward. They were predators, but they were also pragmatists. They could find other small towns, other victims. Misty Vale had become too complicated, too risky, too likely to expose their entire operation. We'll need time to unwind the contracts, Derek said finally, his voice tight with suppressed rage, the admission of defeat bitter in his mouth. You have 1 week, Lorraine said firmly. Every single Misty Vale client released from their obligations, every fee returned in full, every document voided and returned to the signers. I'll be checking personally with each person. And if I find that you've tried to hide assets, delay returns, or intimidate anyone into staying silent, I'll file criminal complaints for fraud and elder abuse in every jurisdiction where you operate. I'll make it my personal mission to end your business. You can't prove criminal intent, Vanessa argued, making one last attempt to salvage something from the confrontation. Maybe not beyond a reasonable doubt, Lorraine conceded. But I can create enough legal trouble, enough negative publicity, enough regulatory scrutiny to put you out of business. I can make operating so expensive and risky that it's no longer profitable. And I will. You have my word on that. And unlike your contracts, my word actually means something. They left in a flurry of barely contained rage, not bothering with polite goodbyes, their expensive briefcases snapping shut with sounds like gunshots. Through the window, Lorraine watched them get into their luxury sedan, watched Derek punch the steering wheel in frustration before peeling out of her driveway, tires squealing as they sped away. After they left, Robert came over from across the street, still carrying his camera. Did you really send reports to all those agencies? He asked, settling into the chair they had vacated. Not yet, Lorraine admitted, suddenly feeling the exhaustion of the confrontation. But I will if they don't follow through. Robert, can you help me draft the documentation? Margaret mentioned you have legal secretary experience. I'll need everything properly formatted, all citations correct, evidence properly organized. I'd be honored, Robert said, and there was genuine admiration in his voice. Lorraine, that was incredible. I've never seen anything like it. Where did you learn to stand up to people like that? Lorraine thought of a courtroom, a gavel, a choice she had made out of fear 15 years ago. She thought of all the nights she had lain awake wondering if she could have been braver, if she should have fought harder, if her surrender had cost more than just one case. I learned it a long time ago, she said softly, but I forgot for a while. I let fear make me small, make me quiet. I'm just remembering now who I used to be, and who I still can be. The next morning, Lorraine opened her bookstore to find a line of people waiting outside. Dorothy Patterson, Harold Green, Evelyn Frost, and a dozen others, all looking anxious and uncertain. We heard, Dorothy said, as Lorraine unlocked the door and ushered them all inside. Thomas Wu's daughter works part-time at the community center, and she overheard Derek Thornton on his phone in the parking lot yesterday evening, absolutely furious, shouting your name and something about that interfering old judge. Is it true? Did you really confront them? Lorraine locked the door behind the group and turned the sign to "Closed for Private Event." She gestured for everyone to find seats among the armchairs and reading nooks scattered throughout the store. I did, she said simply. And they've agreed to release you from your contracts and return your fees. All of them. The relief in the room was palpable, but Evelyn Frost looked skeptical, her years as a school principal having taught her to question easy solutions. Just like that? They'll just give up and return everything? Forgive me, Lorraine, but that seems too good to be true. Not entirely out of the goodness of their hearts, Lorraine admitted. I may have suggested that the alternative would be very expensive legal trouble, significant negative publicity, and potential criminal investigations. But we're not done yet. We need to make sure they follow through, and we need to protect others from similar schemes in the future. How? Harold asked, leaning forward with interest. We can't exactly tell every senior citizen in America to be careful. We start here, Lorraine said, by documenting everything that happened. I need each of you to write down exactly what occurred, every promise they made, every pressure tactic they used, every fee they charged, every misleading statement. Robert Chen has agreed to help me organize the information into formal complaints. If Golden Years Advisory doesn't honor their agreement to release you and return your money, we'll have everything we need for both civil and criminal action. But Lorraine, Margaret said, having joined the group after closing the bakery for a few minutes, you're not a lawyer anymore. Can you even do this? Won't they come after you for practicing law without a license? The room went silent. Lorraine realized that in her confrontation with Derek and his colleagues, she had revealed her past. Now her neighbors knew she wasn't just the friendly bookstore owner they had thought she was for 15 years. She took a breath, deciding that full honesty was the only path forward. No, I'm not a lawyer. I was a judge, a circuit court judge in the city. I retired 15 years ago and came here looking for a quieter life, a place where I could be anonymous, where I could escape from a failure that haunted me. I never meant to deceive anyone. I simply didn't think my past was relevant to running a bookstore and being part of this community. A judge? Thomas Wu breathed, his eyes wide. All this time, and we never knew. 25 years on the bench, and you never mentioned it once? I'm sorry for not being forthcoming, Lorraine said, feeling the weight of the admission. If you feel I've been dishonest by not sharing this, I understand. But right now, what matters most is protecting all of you and making sure this doesn't happen to anyone else, here or in other communities. Dorothy stepped forward and took Lorraine's hand, her grip surprisingly strong for her 83 years. Don't you dare apologize. You don't owe us your entire history. You've been a good friend and neighbor for 15 years. What matters is that when we needed help, when we were being taken advantage of, you used your knowledge and experience to protect us. That's not dishonesty. That's heroism. The others murmured agreement, and Lorraine felt a weight lift from her chest that she hadn't realized she'd been carrying for 15 years. The weight of hiding, of pretending to be someone simpler, of running from her past, instead of integrating it into her present. Over the next week, Lorraine worked tirelessly. With Robert's help, she created a comprehensive case file that would have done any prosecuting attorney proud. She contacted every person in Misty Vale who had dealings with Golden Years Advisory, documenting each interaction in meticulous detail. She organized the contracts, highlighted the problematic clauses, calculated the total fees extracted from each victim. She also reached out to legal aid organizations and elder advocacy groups across the state, building a network of support and resources. She connected with the state's Consumer Protection Division, providing them with preliminary documentation of the scheme, and she made a phone call she had been avoiding for 15 years. Judge Chen's chambers, a voice answered, professional and crisp. Hello, this is Lorraine Adams. I used to work with Judge Michael Chen in the circuit court. Is he available? I know it's late in the day, but it's somewhat urgent. There was a pause. Then Michael Chen's familiar voice came on the line, warm but curious. Lorraine Adams. I wondered if I'd ever hear from you again. You disappeared quite thoroughly after your retirement. Some of us were worried about you. I had my reasons, Lorraine said, her voice catching slightly. Michael, I need advice. Not for me. For some people who need help and don't have anywhere else to turn. She explained the situation with Golden Years Advisory, the contracts, the pressure tactics, the potential fraud, the elderly victims, her confrontation with the company representatives. Michael listened without interruption, and she could almost see him in his chambers, leaning back in his chair, fingers steepled, absorbing every detail with that sharp legal mind she had always admired. You still have the instincts, he said when she finished. This is solid preliminary work, better than what most prosecutors start with. What do you need from me? Guidance on how to proceed. I'm a civilian now. I don't have standing to bring charges, and these people may not have the resources for private attorneys. But I can't just let this go. They're vulnerable, Michael. They're being systematically victimized. But you have documentation and witnesses. That's the foundation of any case. Let me make some calls. I know people in the state attorney general's office who specialize in elder fraud. Sarah Martinez. No relation to Harold Green's granddaughter, just coincidence. She's aggressive and smart, and she hates people who prey on seniors. If your evidence is as strong as you say, she'll be very interested. Thank you, Michael. I'm sorry I didn't stay in touch. I was ashamed. There was a long pause. Lorraine, I know about the Bradford case. What happened with the evidence? The witnesses disappearing, the dismissed charges. There were rumors of threats, pressure from high places. None of us blamed you. I should have fought harder, Lorraine said quietly, the old guilt rising. I should have been braver. You were protecting your family from credible threats of violence. That's not cowardice, that's being human. But Lorraine, Bradford may have won that battle, but he hasn't won the war. There have been investigations ongoing into his administration for the past 3 years. The truth has a way of emerging, even if it takes time. You couldn't have known that then, but justice is patient. After the call, Lorraine sat for a long time in her bookstore office, thinking about justice and patience and second chances. True to Derek's word, or perhaps to his cold calculation of risks and benefits, Golden Years Advisory began processing releases for their Misty Vale clients within days. Fees were returned, contracts voided, titles cleared. Lorraine verified each transaction personally, calling every victim to confirm they had received their money and their freedom. But she didn't trust it to end there. Companies like this didn't simply give up. They rebranded, relocated, found new victims. She had learned from the Bradford case that sometimes the official channels failed, that sometimes the system needed help, that sometimes justice required someone willing to shine a light into dark corners. So she began writing a different kind of document. Not a legal brief, but a story. The story of what had happened in Misty Vale, written in clear, accessible language that any reader could understand. She detailed the scheme, explained how it worked, provided warning signs that seniors and their families should watch for. She sent it to the regional newspaper's consumer affairs reporter, then to the state newspaper's investigative team, then to a journalist she knew who specialized in consumer protection issues and had won awards for exposing scams. Within days, the story broke. Elder fraud scheme exposed in Mountain Town, former judge leads investigation. The article detailed Golden Years Advisory's practices, included interviews with Misty Vale residents who bravely allowed their names to be used, and provided information about how other seniors could protect themselves from similar schemes. It mentioned Lorraine's background, but focused on the victims and the predatory practices, painting a picture that was both specific to this case and illustrative of a broader problem. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Other towns came forward with similar experiences, letters to the editor, calls to the newspaper, emails to the reporter. The pattern became undeniable. The Attorney General's office launched a formal investigation. Consumer protection agencies in multiple states coordinated their efforts. Banking regulators began examining the company's practices. What Lorraine had started in one small town became a regional campaign against elder financial abuse. Golden Years Advisory tried to fight back, issuing carefully worded statements about misunderstandings and unfortunate miscommunications, and a few isolated incidents being blown out of proportion. But the evidence was overwhelming, the pattern too clear, the victims too numerous and sympathetic. Within a month, the company was facing multiple lawsuits and regulatory actions in 4 states. Within 2 months, it had officially dissolved, though Lorraine suspected, correctly, that the principals would simply reform under a new name in different jurisdictions, applying the lessons they had learned about what not to do. But she had created something more lasting than the destruction of one predatory company. She had sparked awareness, started conversations, prompted action. Towns across the region began hosting educational sessions about financial scams. Senior centers started offering free legal consultations. Banks implemented new protections for elderly customers, requiring additional verification for large transactions or unusual account activity. And in Misty Vale, the community center hosted a different kind of dinner, a celebration. The community center was packed to capacity. It seemed like everyone in Misty Vale had turned out, along with people from neighboring towns who had heard the story and wanted to show their support. Sheriff Morrison stood at the microphone, looking uncomfortable with public speaking, but determined to do this right. "Most of you know what happened over the past few months," he began, his voice carrying through the speaker system. "Some bad people tried to take advantage of our neighbors. They thought we were easy targets because we're small, because we're trusting, because we're far from the city and its resources. They didn't count on Lorraine Adams." Applause filled the room, genuine and heartfelt. Lorraine, seated at a table with Margaret and Robert, felt her cheeks warm with a mixture of embarrassment and pleasure. "What many of you didn't know until recently," the sheriff continued, "is that Lorraine brought more than just determination to this fight. She brought 25 years of legal experience, a brilliant legal mind honed by hundreds of cases, and the courage to stand up to bullies even when they threatened her. She protected this community the same way she protected justice for 25 years as a circuit court judge." More applause, louder this time. Dorothy Patterson stood up, and the room quieted to hear her. "I want to say something," Dorothy said, her voice wavering but gaining strength as she spoke. "I was ashamed when I realized I'd been tricked. I felt foolish, stupid, like I should have known better. I didn't want to tell anyone what had happened. But Lorraine made me understand that the shame belonged to the people who tried to cheat us, not to us. She gave me back my dignity along with my savings. And she did it with such kindness, never making me feel worse than I already felt." Harold Green stood next, then Evelyn Frost, then others, each sharing their story, each thanking Lorraine not just for her help, but for treating them with respect and compassion throughout the process, for making them feel like victims of a crime rather than fools who had been duped. Finally, Mayor Patricia Oakes took the microphone, holding a framed certificate. "Lorraine, would you come up here, please?" Reluctantly, Lorraine made her way through the crowd to the front of the room, accepting handshakes and pats on the back as she went. "Lorraine Adams came to our town 15 years ago," the mayor said. "She never asked for special treatment or recognition. She never bragged about her background or her accomplishments. She ran her bookstore, joined our community book club, volunteered at the library, became our friend and neighbor. She could have stayed quiet when she saw what was happening. No one would have blamed her for not getting involved, for protecting her own peace and privacy. But that's not who she is." The mayor held up the certificate for everyone to see. "By the power vested in me by the town council, I hereby declare November 15th as Lorraine Adams Day in Misty Vale, in recognition of her service to this community and her dedication to justice and protecting the vulnerable." As the crowd erupted in applause and cheers, Lorraine felt tears threatening, her carefully maintained composure cracking. She had spent 15 years hiding from her past, convinced that her failure in the Bradford case had disqualified her from ever seeking justice again, from ever being worthy of respect or admiration. But these people, her neighbors, her friends, were telling her that one failure didn't define her entire life, that she still had value, still had something to contribute, that she still mattered. "Thank you," she said into the microphone, her voice thick with emotion. "Thank you for accepting me without question, for trusting me even before you knew my background, and for letting me be part of this wonderful community. I came here running from something I considered my greatest failure, convinced I had betrayed everything I believed in. But you've helped me understand that what truly matters isn't that we never fail. It's what we do afterward. How we learn, how we grow, how we find the courage to try again." After the ceremony, as people mingled and shared food, potluck dishes that represented the diverse heritage of the community, Michael Chen appeared at Lorraine's elbow. She hadn't known he was coming. "Michael, you drove all the way out here?" She was genuinely surprised and touched. "I wanted to see where you've been hiding all these years," he said with a warm smile, "and to tell you something in person that I thought you should hear face to face. Remember I mentioned investigations into Bradford's administration?" Lorraine nodded, her heart suddenly beating faster. "Yesterday morning, a grand jury indicted Governor Richard Bradford on 17 counts of corruption, fraud, racketeering, and abuse of power. The investigation found evidence going back decades, including extensive details about the case you presided over 15 years ago. The prosecutors specifically wanted me to tell you that your original work on that case, all the documents you prepared, the rulings you made before it fell apart, your legal analysis, provided crucial background and foundation for their investigation. They said you built the roadmap they followed. Lorraine steadied herself against a nearby table, the news hitting her with unexpected force. They got him? After all this time? They got him. The case you thought you lost? The failure that drove you into hiding? It turns out you just delayed the verdict. Justice took 15 years, but it arrived. Your work mattered, Lorraine. It always mattered. I wish I had been braver then, Lorraine said quietly, old regrets surfacing despite the good news. You were facing credible, specific threats against your family, against children. That's not cowardice. That's being a human being with people you love. But Lorraine, what you did here, in this town, with these people, that took a different kind of courage. You had every reason to stay quiet, to protect your peace, to avoid conflict and exposure. You could have spent the rest of your retirement reading books and drinking tea, and no one would have thought less of you. But you didn't. You stood up. That's growth. That's strength. That's who you've become. As the evening wore on, Lorraine found herself telling stories she hadn't shared in 15 years. Stories about interesting cases, about the challenges of the bench, about why she had loved the law, about the satisfaction of helping people navigate the legal system. Her neighbors listened with fascination, asking questions, seeing her in a new light that somehow made her seem more rather than less approachable. Why did you really become a judge? Young Sarah Martinez asked. She was Harold Greene's granddaughter, studying pre-law at the State University, her eyes bright with the idealism that Lorraine remembered feeling herself decades ago. Lorraine thought about it, wanting to give an honest answer. Because I believed that the law, properly applied with both rigor and compassion, could protect the vulnerable from the powerful. I believed that in a courtroom, truth and justice could prevail over money and influence. I believed that the system, despite its flaws, could work if people of integrity were willing to make it work. I still believe that even though it doesn't always work out that way, even after my own failures. But sometimes it does, Sarah said softly. Like here. Like what you did for my grandfather and everyone else. You proved it can work. Sometimes it does, Lorraine agreed, smiling at the young woman's enthusiasm. And those times make all the difficulty worthwhile. They make the failures bearable. Later, as the crowd thinned and people began heading home, Robert Chen approached with Margaret at his side, both looking serious but excited. Margaret and I have been talking, Robert said. We think Misty Vale needs something permanent, not just to remember what happened, but to prevent it from happening again. We want to create an elder advocacy program. Free legal advice, financial literacy classes, someone to review contracts before seniors sign them, resources for people who feel confused or pressured. And we'd like you to lead it. Me? Robert, I'm not a lawyer anymore. I can't practice law. I could get in serious trouble if I crossed that line. We don't need you to be a lawyer, Margaret interjected. We need you to be what you've been for the past month, someone who understands the law well enough to help people protect themselves, to recognize when something's wrong, to know when to escalate to actual attorneys. You don't have to represent people in court. You just have to use your knowledge to help them navigate a complicated world. Lorraine looked around the community center, at the faces of people she had come to love over 15 years. People who had given her refuge when she needed it, who had accepted her without knowing her history, who now wanted her to use that history to help protect them and others. I'd be honored, she said, feeling pieces of herself coming together, past and present, failure and redemption, hiding and standing tall. I'd be truly honored. 6 months later, Lorraine stood in her bookstore, which now doubled as the office for the Misty Vale Elder Advocacy Program. The back room that had once held only overflow inventory now contained filing cabinets full of resources, a computer for researching legal questions, comfortable meeting spaces where seniors could come for advice, and a small library of legal guides written in plain language. She had just finished a session with a couple in their 70s who were considering a home equity loan to help their daughter buy a house. She had helped them understand the terms, compare options from different lenders, recognize red flags in the contracts, and think through the long-term implications. It wasn't practicing law. She was careful to stay within appropriate boundaries, always recommending they consult with licensed attorneys for final decisions. But it was using her knowledge to protect people, which was all she had ever wanted to do. The bell above the door chimed. A woman entered, looking around uncertainly. She was perhaps 70, well-dressed in a way that suggested comfort but not wealth, her expression anxious. "Can I help you?" Lorraine asked warmly. "I hope so. I'm visiting my sister in Rivertown, and she told me about what you did here, about the program you started. I think I'm being scammed by a company selling living trust packages. The fees seem extraordinarily high, and they're pressuring me to sign quickly, saying the prices will go up next week. But something doesn't feel right. Could you look at the contract? My sister said you were someone who could be trusted." Lorraine gestured to the comfortable chairs in the consultation area. "Of course, that's exactly what we're here for. Let's take a look together." As the woman pulled documents from her purse, Lorraine felt a deep sense of rightness, of being exactly where she was meant to be, doing exactly what she was meant to do. This was her courtroom now. Not an official one with mahogany benches and formal procedures, but one where she could still pursue justice. Not with a gavel and the power of the state, but with knowledge, patience, compassion, and determination. She thought about the path that had led her here, the idealism of her early career, the satisfaction of making a difference, the painful compromise of the Bradford case, the years of self-imposed exile and hiding, and finally, the rediscovery of her purpose in the most unexpected place. It hadn't been a straight line. She had stumbled, fallen, hidden from herself and others. But in the end, she had found her way back to what mattered. Later that evening, after the woman had left with a much clearer understanding of what she was being asked to sign, and with a referral to a legitimate estate planning attorney who charged reasonable fees, Lorraine locked up the bookstore and walked home through streets where she now knew every face, where people waved and called out greetings, where she truly belonged. She thought about what Dorothy Patterson had said at the celebration, "You gave me back my dignity." But the truth was far more reciprocal than that. These people had given Lorraine back her sense of purpose, her belief in her own worth, her understanding that redemption was possible even after the worst failures, her faith that justice, while often delayed, was still worth fighting for. In her living room, Lorraine looked at the framed certificate declaring Lorraine Adams Day, now hanging on the wall where visitors could see it. Next to it, she had hung something else, a photograph from her judicial days, showing her in robes, holding a gavel, looking stern and authoritative. For years, she had kept that photo packed away in a box in her attic, unable to look at it without feeling overwhelming shame and regret. Now she saw it differently. That woman in the photograph wasn't a failure or a coward. She was someone who had dedicated her life to justice, who had faced an impossible situation with threats against her family, who had made a painful choice that haunted her, but that any person might have made. She was human, flawed, imperfect, doing her best in a complex world where the right choice wasn't always clear. And the woman Lorraine was now, older, gentler, but no less determined, was the continuation of that same journey. Not a different person, but the same person who had learned, grown, been broken and rebuilt, found new ways to fight for what was right. She had learned something essential over these past months. Justice wasn't just something that happened in courtrooms with official procedures and legal authority. It happened in bookstores and community centers, in quiet conversations and careful documentation, in the courage of ordinary people standing up to protect each other. She had also learned that it was never too late for redemption. Not for herself, not for anyone. The Bradford case would always be there, a scar, a reminder of a moment when fear had won. But it didn't have to be the end of the story or the defining moment of her life. It could be a chapter in a longer narrative, one that included this second act, this different kind of victory, this proof that failure wasn't final. Her phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was Sarah Martinez, Harold's granddaughter. "Mrs. Adams, I hope I'm not calling too late. I just wanted to tell you, I got my acceptance letter today. I'm going to law school. They offered me a partial scholarship." "Sarah, that's wonderful. Congratulations. I'm so proud of you." "I wanted to thank you. Watching what you did here, seeing how the law can actually help people when it's used properly, seeing how knowledge and determination could stand up to money and power, it reminded me why I wanted to do this in the first place. I was getting discouraged, thinking maybe I should do something more practical, something with more certain financial returns. But you showed me that legal knowledge is a tool for protecting people, for making the world more just. That's what I want to do too. I want to be like you." After the call, Lorraine sat for a long time, thinking about legacy and influence and the ripple effects of our actions, about how we touch lives in ways we can't always see or predict. She had thought her career was over, her influence finished, her contribution to justice concluded when she resigned from the bench. But here was evidence that her work was continuing through others, that her example was inspiring the next generation, that even her failures had taught lessons about resilience and second chances. Maybe that was the real justice. Not the verdict in any single case, but the accumulation of small acts of courage and kindness over a lifetime. Building a world where people looked out for each other, where the vulnerable were protected, where right mattered more than might, where one person standing up could inspire others to do the same. She thought about the speech she would give next week at the regional conference on elder protection, where she had been invited to share Misty Vale's experience, about the consultation she had scheduled with another small town dealing with similar issues, asking for her guidance, about the training session she was organizing for local bank employees to help them identify signs of financial abuse, about the curriculum she was developing with Sarah's help to teach financial literacy to seniors. Her courtroom might be smaller now, less formal, without official authority. But her reach was wider. Her influence might be unofficial, but her impact was real and growing. As she prepared for bed, Lorraine caught sight of herself in the mirror. 67 years old, silver-haired, wearing comfortable clothes and sensible shoes. She looked like a grandmother, a bookstore owner, a small-town retiree. Appearances could be deceiving, she thought with a small smile. She was Lorraine Adams. She had been a judge. She had succeeded and failed, been brave and been afraid, run away and come back, fallen and risen. She had thought her story was over and discovered it was just beginning a new chapter, perhaps the most important one. And tomorrow, when she opened the bookstore, when she helped someone understand a contract, or recognize a scam, or simply feel less alone in navigating a confusing world, when she used her knowledge to protect someone who couldn't protect themselves, she would be doing exactly what she was meant to do. The weight of the gavel she once carried had been heavy, the responsibility of judgment, the burden of authority, the consequences of every decision affecting people's lives. She no longer carried that literal weight, no longer bore that official responsibility. But she carried something equally important: the knowledge that she could make a difference, the determination to keep trying, the wisdom that came from both failure and success, and the understanding that justice was not a destination, but a journey, not a single verdict, but a lifetime of trying. In the end, that was the truest form of justice. Not a single case won or lost, not one perfect decision, but a lifetime of trying to do right. Failing sometimes, succeeding others, learning from both, and never, ever giving up the fight. Lorraine turned off the light and climbed into bed, ready for whatever tomorrow would bring. Because now she knew with absolute certainty, it was never too late to stand up for justice. Never too late to protect the vulnerable. Never too late to use your knowledge and experience to make the world a little bit better. Never too late to become the person you were always meant to be, even if it took 15 years and a small mountain town to find your way back to yourself. And that, she thought, as sleep claimed her, was enough. More than enough. It was everything. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. We'd love to hear what inspired you the most. And where in the world are you watching from? Let us know below.